Hello, my name is Ronald Stanley, and I'm presenting with Andrew Mertheris, and we're presenting on the MVC pattern of model view and controller. I'm going to go ahead and start this off. So, what is the MVC pattern, you ask? It's a way of programming with a model view and controller. Throughout the presentation, we're going to talk about these terms. So I'll start off by giving you a summary of how each one works. So models. Model objects are the part of the application that implement the logic for the application's data domain. Often, model objects retrieve and store model state in a database. For example, a product object might retrieve information from a database, operate on it, and then write updated information back to a products table in an SQL Server database. So this is common with some of the PHP stuff that we do. So views. Views are the components that display the application's user interface or UI. Typically, this UI is created from the model data. An example would be an edit view of a products table that displays text box, drop-down lists, and checks boxes based on the current state of a product object. Controllers. Controllers are the components that handle user interactions, work with the model, and ultimately select a view to render that displays in the UI. So when you first load up a web page, it automatically goes to the controller, and based on the criteria that's passed through, it decides and renders a UI or a view. So in an MVC application, the view only displays information. The controller handle only responds to user input and interaction. For example, the controller handles query string values and passes these values to the model, which in turn might use these values to query the database. Okay, we're going to go to the next slide here. So what are the upsides to model view controller coding? The first one we'll talk about is asynchronous application support. And which is when we use a programming language like JavaScript or Node.js. This makes it so that the MVC application can be made to work with PDF files and things like desktop widgets. This support helps developers to develop an application that loads very fast. The next point is that it is modular because there are three parts, the model, view, and controller. Different developers are able to work on the different parts of the application at the same time. And this causes the development process to be much faster. Someone can say, up to 3 times as fast. Lastly, a high level of control is seen with MVC applications. Because of MVC, one does not need to use view state or server-based forms. And this makes the MVC framework ideal for those developers who want full control over the behavior of an application and want it very structured. So it's going, from one state to the next. All right, let's see. And now we're going to talk about the downsides of model view controller. Now, the downsides are kind of interesting because they can be the downsides for those who may not be as experienced with MVC or the programming in general, but maybe actual upsides to those who have an expert level of experience or, a very expert level of MVC. So first, we have increased complexity. While using the MVC model, it's a preferred method for many. It can increase a program in complexity greatly, though. So you have to know how all three pieces of MVC work together in order for things to run smoothly and have a great understanding of it. It can increase the complexity quite a bit, though. Next, a MVC program may need multiple programmers. So if you're working alone or on a smaller project, it may be hard to fully implement the MVC layout yourself or more time sensitive. So lastly, this brings us to implementation of smaller programs. When working on small websites or applications, MVC can be a bit overkill for some programmers depending on their skill level. And sometimes there's easier ways. So we'll go ahead and move on to Andrew here, and he's going to talk about demonstrating.
Okay, so the application that we are using for our class is the Bank of Dad application, and a model view controller is actually basically a good pattern to use for the overall architecture of the program. So the application is going to be on mobile, which is a prime use case of the MVC pattern. The reason for this is because the code can basically be split into 3 modular components. And as our class is a large team, that becomes really easy for several reasons. So the model would be the database, which stores the information from the user that they input through the application, including the login information that they give, as well as important information specifically to the app, such as the user's balance or the debt that they owe and things like that. The view would obviously be the UI portion. This consists of 2 parts. Basically, there's going to be displays where the user can see information on the screen that they want to know, as well as input fields where they can input data, which is then passed to the controller, and then the controller will process it and store it. And then lastly, the controller basically acts as the middleman between the other 2 pieces, the model and the view. So what happens is the view can receive input from the user, which gets passed to the controller. The controller can process that data and then pass it along to the model to be stored in the database. And likewise, the model can, when requested, can send data to the controller, which then displays it to the user. And that's basically how we would use it with our application, just like you'd use it with any other application. Next slide, please. And then for recommendations on when to use this, I've already talked about this a little bit just based on our example. But basically, the MVC is good for whenever you're using a web or a mobile application. The reason for this was mentioned during the upsides, but basically because of its compatibility with asynchronous applications, this becomes really useful because web and mobile applications are often asynchronous. And then secondly, Model View Controller is really good for large teams. Again, we've already talked about this a little bit as well, but basically what happens is when you have a large team and you have these 3 separate pieces, then you can split the program into, you can split the team into 3 different teams. So you have the UI team or the front end team who works on the view, and they can basically just specialize in a language like JavaScript or Angular and create just the UI components of the application. And then they pass it along to the people who are on the back end of the application. And the back end people specialize in the model type of stuff, processing data and being the middleman between the database and the user interface. And then lastly, you can have database management type of people who develop the model for that piece of it. Next slide, please. Okay, and then lastly, we just wanted to briefly go over the test questions that are going to be important to know. So basically, we want you to know that MVC stands for Model, View, and Controller. If you know that, then you can look up anything else you need to know about what is a model, what is a view, what is a controller. And then lastly, you should know what the upsides are and what the downsides are of the MVC so that you can know when to use it and when not to. And then lastly, on the next slide, we just have our sources from our presentation, and that is it.